Well, this is surreal. When Final Fantasy Versus XIII was announced, I couldn't really call myself a Final Fantasy fan. At the time, I thought that Versus XIII was some multiplayer spin-off for the then upcoming Final Fantasy XIII. It wasn't until a few years later that I got into the franchise through Final Fantasy IV for the DS. That, alongside my growing interest in Kingdom Hearts, caused me to rediscover Versus XIII, and I was worried I wasn't going to get to play it. Because of the level of blood and violence in the trailer, people speculated the game would be rated M. And if it was, there was no way I'd be able to convince my parents to buy it for me, being 14. But here we are now. And even if it were rated M, now I'm old enough to buy it without even showing ID. Final Fantasy XV has been a long time coming, to say the least. I honestly wanted to avoid talking about the Versus XIII version of Final Fantasy XV, but they're just too deeply intertwined to ignore. If you're interested in this game at all, I do not recommend looking up old trailers for this game. Cut content doesn't even begin to describe it. Character changes, missing scenes, heavily altered scenes, missing characters. But more than any of that, the old trailers show the combat system from Tetsuya Nomura's tenure as game director, before being replaced by Hajime Tabata of Crisis Core and Final Fantasy Type 0 fame. And while the combat systems Tabata has come up with in his games have always been alright, they just don't compare to Tetsuya Nomura and the pedigree he brings from Kingdom Hearts. So seriously, watching external content for this game will probably make it more disappointing for you. And yet, Square Enix decided to go and make it a multimedia project. In addition to some mobile spin-offs, portions of the story are told through the feature-length movie Kingsglaive and the 5-part anime Brotherhood. While I honestly don't think either are essential to understand the main thrust of the story, Brotherhood helps to flesh out the cast, and Kingsglaive helps to make some plot points more clear, so I still have to recommend them on some level. You might as well at least watch Brotherhood, it's freely available online, and in my opinion it's a much better watching experience than Kingsglaive. But that's enough preamble, it's time to finally get to the game. Final Fantasy XV is primarily open world in design, with some smaller linear bits sprinkled throughout the adventure. In terms of gameplay and structure, it shares a lot with previous entries in the franchise, specifically Hajime Tabata's Final Fantasy Type 0 and the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy that the game was once part of as Versus XIII. The finale of the 13 trilogy, Lightning Returns, in particular feels like a testing ground for ideas used in Final Fantasy XV, with its open world design, focus on questing, day-night cycle, as well as smaller things like going to restaurants to buy food to heal. On the other hand, Final Fantasy XV feels a lot like Type 0 in terms of tone, and shares a lot of common DNA with the combat system. These games, along with Final Fantasy XII, are my main reference points to Final Fantasy XV. A fantasy based on reality. This has always been Final Fantasy XV's tagline. Throughout its 10-year life, this is one of very few things that managed to stay the same. The idea of a grounded fantasy has always appealed a lot to me, ever since I was a kid. The idea of a magic crystal being a tourist attraction, crazy monsters being a part of everyday life, the practical everyday application of magic. I think it's common for kids to gravitate towards that idea in some capacity, whether it's the magic world of Harry Potter, finding the door to Narnia, or any other story like that. And that childlike attitude is present throughout the open world portion of this game. For example, if you check the description of healing items you find at stores, you can see that they're just normal everyday items, like energy drinks. The reason that they have healing properties is because of the main character Noctis's powers. Another example is how light and dark serve as a crux for the gameplay, where venturing out at night will cause you to be attacked by powerful demons. It's stuff like this that gives exploring the world a childlike sense of adventure. Unfortunately, if you're not a little kid, and if you're playing Final Fantasy XV then you're probably not, the world itself has some problems. The biggest one is, well, the biggest one. The map is huge. I'm not talking in terms of sheer size, but in the sense of scale. It can be very atmospheric, driving a car through a realistically proportioned road, seeing a forest that's genuinely a collection of trees, not a weird maze with clusters of trees forming walls around you. When you sit back and relax, the world of Final Fantasy XV can be incredibly immersive, and this is helped in a big way by the fact that it's absolutely gorgeous, but when you're trying to get things done, it can become a pain. The map is wide and incredibly open, to the point where finding invisible walls is incredibly off-putting, but for all its freedom, it's incredibly sparse. This is where being based on reality actively hurts the game. There's simply nothing to do on the way from one point to the next. When you drive, there's a hope that you might run into a random event or trigger a random conversation, but more often than not, you'll simply drive along for minutes at a time with nothing happening. But driving the car is automated. You can just turn on some music and relax. When you're on foot, the problem exasperates. Running through a field can also trigger some random dialogue, but on foot, more often than not, it's simply some repeating generic comments about the weather. And because you directly control your movement, you have to focus somewhat, and there's just not enough to interact with to make it engaging. You can find some randomized treasures in the form of glowing blue and red spots, but they lack the permanence of treasure chests from previous games because they respawn frequently. Even when you find some notable location on the map, more often than not you'll only be rewarded with some generic treasure, or more often than not nothing at all. This is compounded by the choice to make sprinting an action tied to a stamina bar. There's a trick you can use, where if you stop sprinting right before the bar runs out, your stamina will be completely refilled. But for some reason, by default, the game doesn't show you your stamina bar. You have to turn it on in the options menu. This makes doing the trick almost impossible. But once you turn it on, the trick is incredibly easy to do, making it more like minor busy work than anything else. And you need to be careful where you sprint because the characters in this game do not shut up. For the most part, this isn't a bad thing. There are plenty of instances where the characters will have completely unique comments on the situation at hand, though unfortunately their dialogue can be cut off very easily by other incidental dialogue. For example, I once had some moderately important story dialogue cut off by a character warning me about some incoming enemies. Not only that, but at times characters would literally interrupt themselves to say something else. But the bigger problem here is the baffling decision to make it so that characters will react to you when you bump into them or hit them with your weapons. It was charming the first time, but pretty soon I got sick of characters yelling at me every time I decided to start sprinting, or they happened to walk into one of my attacks.
Temper.
Even the simple act of switching weapons is enough to trigger this dialogue. I don't know why they didn't make this a one-time thing, or a rare Easter egg, but as it stands, it's a touch frustrating. And on the topic of weapons, let's dig into the combat. I really don't want to call it bad, because it's not. There's some very functional mechanics here. Warping, swapping weapons, using magic. The basic idea is you hold down the attack button to continuously attack, and you hold down the defend button to constantly avoid attacks at the cost of magic points. You can parry certain attacks when the parry icon appears, and then launch a counter attack. You can swap up to 4 equipped weapons at a time for different attacks, and you can also call on your friends for attacks by using a tech gauge that gradually fills up over time. Plus there are team-up moves called link attacks that trigger at random when you're attacking an enemy normally or using a warp strike. There's also some weird cover mechanic where you can hide behind things to recover health and magic faster, but you're better off using a thing called a point warp, which takes you to a high point and fully restores your magic. And if there's no point you can warp to, you might as well just use an item. And speaking of warping, I find it baffling that they decided to make it so you can only warp to points on the map during combat. There are a handful of missions where you can use the warp ability freely to do some half-baked stealth stuff, and I think that should have been available to you constantly because it makes getting around way more fun. At the very least, being able to warp around freely would allow you to plan attacks a bit more carefully. So yeah, the combat is functional, the issue is design. First and foremost, if you take a look back at those old trailers, you can see how much mobility Noctis has lost. Him and his party members have much slower, clunkier attacks now. There's a real lack of definition to the attacks you're using. It feels more like you're controlling a stream of animations. Lightning Returns and Type 0 both use similar combat styles, but those are both heavily focused on exploiting timing-based weaknesses. And while not quite the same, Final Fantasy XII had an auto attack as well, but that was more of a way to fill time while you use other, more useful techniques. I think that Final Fantasy XV's combat would be best suited for slow-paced duels against a single opponent, but the game rarely has you do that, instead having you fight large groups of enemies with fast, unpredictable attacks, or unblockable area of effect abilities. The combat really sags under the weight of these choices. Honestly, I think I can pinpoint this down to 2 problems. The first one you can find in nearly any action game that uses RPG stats and damage numbers. Enemies have bloated health bars and barely ever stagger. Because I did so many of the side quests, I ended up being pretty overpowered, and this honestly improved my game experience. The little mob enemies will go down in 2 or 3 hits instead of a dozen. The other one is a lack of a consistent way to perform area of effect attacks. There are attacks that let you hit enemies all around you, but the 2 most reliable are team attacks and magic, both of which have limitations and require a gauge to be filled up in order to use. So I went back and dug up some footage of Final Fantasy XV Episode the Sky, a demo that came packaged with Final Fantasy Type 0. A lot has changed from that demo. The combat has more or less been completely overhauled, as has Noctis' comically awful voice.
We're as good as dead without the car anyway. The money. It's bedtime. Huh.
One of the key changes is the removal of weapon techniques. In the demo version, Noctis could consume magic points in order to perform special attacks. Things like drain an enemy's health to heal himself, do a jump attack, or, you guessed it, an area of effect attack. Because of this demo and another later demo, the Platinum demo, we know that the gameplay of Final Fantasy XV was overhauled pretty late into development. And looking at all of those things together, it leads me to believe that the design of this game wasn't updated enough after the combat was changed so much. It would go a long way to explain why the combat mechanics themselves are good, but the situations the game often puts you in don't make good use of them. But outside of that, another huge problem is the game's camera. In tight spaces it flings itself around wildly, trying to fit everything in. But out in open space, you'll often find yourself completely obscured by giant bushes and other decorative objects. Finally, it's not just your own attacks that feel like a stream. A lot of the attack animations of other enemies, especially the animals, simply don't read like attacks. As such, it comes as a bit of a surprise sometimes when an enemy knocks you over, especially when it takes significantly more effort on your part to do the same to your enemies. Which leads me into the final wrinkle of the combat, magic. It's cool in concept, it's visually amazing. Easily the most powerful tool in your arsenal, but not without its own problems. The idea behind magic is that it's powerful but indiscriminate. In other words, friendly fire is on. Magic is crafted in a menu and thrown like a grenade. You can only hold a finite amount of magic, though that capacity grows as you continue in the story and find secrets. But another limitation it has is a timer you must wait through before you can use magic again. Because of this, magic can be pretty pace-breaking, since it usually means pausing the game to go and equip some magic when you want to use it, or going and putting a weapon back in its place after you've used it all up. Because it's not super easy to use, I was expecting it to be more of a sneak attack type deal. Like you see some enemies, drop a Thunderga on them, and end the fight before it even began. But you can't throw magic until combat has been initiated. And the game won't always let you use the magic either, sometimes forcing you to run towards the enemy until it decides you're in range. Besides that, once combat is initiated, there's no way to control where your party members go, so you basically have to write them off as collateral damage. You can pretty easily craft magic that will engulf the entire battlefield, and when you use it right, enemies will be frozen in their tracks, or paralyzed through electricity and unable to move. High-level magic also deals insane damage, often making short work of bosses, and the environments react to the magic as well. Foliage will burn, water will freeze, and metal will conduct electricity. However, as time went on, especially later in the game, I started to notice a problem. I'd blast an enemy with powerful magic, leaving behind an area full of fire or coursing with electricity. Being in this area had little to no effect on enemies, and when I tried to close in to attack them, my characters would catch fire, get electrocuted, take damage, and get stunned. This is a common form of balancing in mid to late game, where stuff is simply not effective on enemies, but all of your characters are still vulnerable. As you play the game, your actions will be complemented by a soundtrack created by one of my favorite composers, Yoko Shimomura. The game falls into an open world trap I hate, where a lot of the time music simply won't play as you explore. But you can get around that by buying an MP3 player, which lets you listen to classic Final Fantasy music as you run around. Unfortunately, and I hate saying this, I think Shimomura might have been miscast for this game. While there's a lot of excellent music, there's also a lot of music that sounds generic and lifeless, which is a huge contrast from her usual work in games like the Mario and Luigi RPGs or Kingdom Hearts. That said, she shines as usual during battle sequences, and her slower piano and violin pieces are also incredibly evocative. I know a lot of this stuff that I said sounds incredibly negative, but I really did enjoy the game. There are plenty of really well done sequences in this game, and when the battle system works, it works. Magic is also incredibly impressive, but more than any of that is the execution of the story. The characters are endearing, and they avoid falling into overbearing cliches like previous Final Fantasy games have. One simple way to put it, the character who fills the role of being the strong guy, Gladio, will at times pull out a book and read it while driving in the car. If this was a lesser game, they would have Ignis, the smart one, do it. because he's the smart one. The characters manage to feel very grounded, more like human beings reacting to different situations, rather than being forced to be one simple type of character. The amount of incidental dialogue, sprinkled liberally throughout the entire game, plays a huge part in humanizing these characters, and in particular, I think that special mention should go to Noctis' voice actor, Ray Chase, who went from his laughable Disguise performance to one of the most well-voiced Final Fantasy characters, period. In particular, his performance during the later chapters when things start to get intense is phenomenal. In fact, Final Fantasy XV owes a lot to his excellent voice cast and direction. They form the backbone to the heart this game presents, and go a long way to carry the game past the problems it has in its main story. Unfortunately, that's all spoilers. I'm probably going to have to make a second video to talk about all that other stuff. In terms of quests, Final Fantasy unfortunately went for quantity over quality. There are over 100 quests to do, and a lot of them are bland and lifeless. In addition to some generic nameless quest givers, there are 14 main quest givers. These 14 major NPCs have the quest with the best rewards and the highest chance of actually being interesting. Plus, helping them out has a kinda cool payoff at the end. Unfortunately, even then, the quality of these quests is still inconsistent. Sometimes they'll be really involved, leading you to a new area or fighting against an exclusive enemy. Other times you'll spend way too long hunting frogs. I'll give this game one thing though. It's one of very few open world games to not give you some special mode that highlights everything important for you. And honestly, Noctis probably has the most excuses going for him to justify having a gameplay mechanic like that. But they don't, and as such, searching for things is genuinely a search. You actually have to pay attention. It can get frustrating, but in my mind that's still better than having everything spoon-fed to you. Also, screw fishing. Besides quests, there are also hunts. These are very reminiscent of Final Fantasy XII, but again they went more for quantity. They task you with finding and killing an enemy, usually for some very good rewards. However, there are some weird choices behind it. First and foremost, you can only accept one hunt at a time, which isn't great because there's dozens of hunts, so you're going to spend a lot of time going back and forth between diners where you can accept hunts and the location of the hunt itself. There's also, again, just a sort of lack of variety. A lot of the time you'll fight the same enemy as before, but with higher stats. Just like quests, it's a mixed bag, since some hunts are the only way to encounter cool new enemies. Final Fantasy XV is a game where you can see the stitches of at least two other games holding it together, and nothing makes it more obvious than the control scheme. The big thing? For some insane reason, sprinting and attacking are mapped to the same button. This causes problems, to say the least. Sometimes you'll be trying to attack an enemy, but instead Noctis will sprint off in the direction you're tilting. Other times you'll be sprinting through a normal area, only to suddenly trigger combat mode and start attacking an enemy you didn't want to. Or if you're trying to run away from an enemy, either because it's too powerful, too weak to bother with, or you're just not feeling like it, sometimes you'll trigger an attack. And to top all that off is a third baffling decision. For some strange reason, it seems that in combat mode, Noctis can target treasures and other interactable objects. It's inconsistent, but more than the few times I found Noctis sprinting off towards a treasure point, completely ignoring the enemy right in front of him when I held down the attack button. And for the life of me, I can't understand why. But I digress. They could have easily mapped sprinting to a trigger. Instead, the free L2 button is mapped to your MP3 player. But it only gets weirder when you find yourself riding a chocobo. These things are the real way to get around, being significantly faster than sprinting, and being able to go off-road unlike your car. The control scheme for a chocobo is completely different from normal gameplay though. The jump button becomes the dismount button, the sprint button becomes the jump button, and the right trigger, normally devoted to bringing up your items menu, now makes your chocobo sprint. The Disguise demo also featured a different control scheme, so it seemed like they couldn't pin down a control method until the very end. Also, a small inconvenience with chocobos, you can't pick up treasures until you dismount from them. It makes exploring and treasure hunting more awkward than it should be. I also think it's worth mentioning that the chocobo control scheme is pretty similar to the control scheme in Lightning Returns. So yeah, Final Fantasy XV is a bit of a mess, but it's a clean mess, if that makes any sense. On its own, it's a fine game, not my favorite Final Fantasy, but good enough to stand among the rest. I've been more negative than I thought I would be in this review, but frankly, Final Fantasy XV has a lot of problems. I just enjoyed the game a lot despite that. For every awkward battle, there's one that plays great. For every bit of repeated dialogue, there's a completely unique conversation. And for every bungled story beat, there's a genuine heartfelt moment. The story, like a lot of Hajime Tabata's work, is enjoyable and heartfelt, but the individual plot points can be lackluster. And unfortunately, a lot of the content being cut to put into the movie or the anime, as well as just plain old being cut, really makes the game feel like it's lacking meat in some places. So Final Fantasy XV's problem, to the surprise of no one, is its legacy. There's so much that it could have been, so much that it was shown to be, and it makes it feel like it's missing something. And apparently Square Enix feels the same way, because in addition to their season pass of DLC, they've announced a bunch of free updates coming, planning on adding cutscenes, quality of life changes to the gameplay, and other features. And looking at that, after all this time, it's weird to say this, but it feels like Final Fantasy XV needed a little bit more time in the oven. But what's done is done, and I really hope that these updates end up making the game a more enjoyable, complete experience in the future. Also, the ending almost made me cry. Thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a day or a night comment below. And if you like this video, you should check out So I've Been Playing World of Final Fantasy by Thor High Heels. I've also made a few other Final Fantasy videos if you want to check those. If you want to watch me dance around spoilers live before your eyes, you can follow me at HatTalk on Twitter. And one more thing. As of this video, I've decided to go where all the cool kids are going. So I'll be posting my videos on a new site called VidMe. I don't know where all that's going to go, but if you want to watch my videos there, now you can. Upvotes and follows are appreciated, I think. I don't really know how it works yet. And with all that said, thanks for watching.